So, good morning. Today I have the pleasure to interview Rory Sutherland. So, he's the vice chairman of Ogilvy, a prestigious advertising agency. He writes for The Spectator and he's wrote several books, which I've been a fan of. So, Rory has also given TED Talks over the last year. He's blown on TikTok algorithm with reaching an even wider and broader audience. Okay, so for my first question, last year I was binge watching Mad Men, and it's centered around the advertising agency in New York in the 1960s. However, in the show, there's actually quite a few references to Ogilvy, and obviously there's a few British characters who like pop up. So there's one scene where Peter Campbell actually gets an interview with Ogilvy, and he calls in sick that day. So following on from that, what are your overall thoughts and opinions on Mad Men and its portrayal of ad agencies in New York in the 1960s?
Well, interestingly, by the way, I have to praise them for using the names of real agencies. I have no idea whether they needed to ask for permission to do this. But in a way, if you think about it, for 90% of the population, you could have made up agency names. Obviously, Sterling Cooper was an invented agency, but I thought it did add a considerable veracity that they talked about McCann and Ogilvy and so on. Um, uh, you know, well, personally, just for me, I'm glad they didn't, make it entirely fictitious. It seemed to me, at least, it rooted it much more in reality. I spoke fantastically to, unfortunately, I think he died about a year ago, but someone who was literally in New York and then later in Chicago in that era. And his wife was a copywriter as well, I think. He was a great guy called Joel Raffleson. His father had been Samson Raffleson, who is a great Hollywood scriptwriter. He wrote all the scripts for Ernst Lubitsch's films and so forth. It was very funny because I said, You've obviously been watching Mad Men. They were at that stage, this would have been about 2010, 2015, and they were in Chicago at the time. They'd moved to Ogilvy, Chicago, and then retired to Chicago, although they were both New Yorkers. I suppose I can't think of it. Raffleson must have grown up in California. Um, and it was a very funny response because he said it was absolutely nothing like that. It's an absolute grotesque misrepresentation of the work. And his wife said, "What on earth do you mean, Joel? It was exactly like that." And I think there's some truth in that, in that what it depicts undoubtedly happened. Okay. Um, However, it was accurate, but perhaps not representative. So, I mean, one other colleague of mine, a much older colleague, also sadly since dead, who remembers that period, said, "You've got to remember that a large part of American business then was very puritanical."
Yeah.
And they do hint at that, actually. But he remembers that the board of directors of J. Walter Thompson, New York, had come over before Christmas with their spouses, as would have happened then, and gone to the J. Walter Thompson Christmas party, which would have been a pretty urbane, civilized affair. But they were horrified that there seemed to be quite a lot of dancing. And there were a lot of agencies at the time which wouldn't take alcohol accounts. So it's worth noting, obviously, they've chosen an ad agency, I think, as a very, very good place, both chronologically and in terms of representation, to depict what are both extraordinary changes going on in the United States in the
Yeah,
period.
they took all the big moments, didn't it? Like JFK's assassination, landing on the moon, etc., etc.
Absolutely. And also the contradictions that are inherent in the United States in some ways all the time, because it is an entity which is devoted notionally to the pursuit of happiness. Um, and yet it's always had certainly a religious element which is uncomfortable with that. And so, as I said, quite serious ad agencies wouldn't have taken alcohol accounts in the 1950s or 1960s. The United States, as depicted, was generally much more staid in reality than it is in fiction. And of course, you have to realize that that's part of the weird contradiction of the United States. Now, obviously, the exciting stuff gets depicted on film much more than the stage stuff, because whatever you think of church attendance or general moral homilies, they're not actually altogether, all that telegenic or all that entertaining. But there is. I was watching a YouTube documentary the other day. I watch more or less. I think I watch YouTube more than I watch everything else put together now on my television. I mean, and I don't think this would have been true in the UK, but Some Like It Hot was a deeply controversial film in the United States because it featured men dressed up as women. So this decision to make a film with men dressed up as women wasn't just that'll be a bit of a laugh. Now, I think in the UK, and I'm guessing this, but I don't think it would have been contentious in the UK. We've had pantomime for going back, 100 years. So you suddenly start to understand, I think, from that there are some areas of politics, for example, transgender issues, which to some extent our level of kind of intensity in the debate is something we've imported from the United States. But
Exactly.
perhaps it was never quite there, to the same extent. It was rather like in certain periods you had this great business about, police brutality. Okay, well, that started becoming extremely potent as a kind of touch point in the United Kingdom, to which a few people were saying, "But this is not quite the same as the United States, not least because
Why are we taking the
90% of our police are mostly unarmed." Okay, oh, that's less than it once was. It would have been more or less 100% in my early childhood. Um, but obviously, various things have necessitated a degree of arming the police. But you couldn't claim for a second that the level of I'm not just by the way I'm not disputing for a second there has been police brutality in the UK, but it's not quite equivalent. And so the UK has this slightly strange thing of, to some extent, sometimes importing American controversies wholesale, whereas, of course, the United States is in certain respects, is just a bit of an outlier. I mean, Canada, no part of the British Empire, I think, ever had prohibition, other than those which were Islamic countries. The United States is prone in certain ways, perhaps because if you're a country that's invented yourself, you're always going to have a few more debates about things which other people just take as read. But I thought it was interesting because what was so clever was where could you have set it in a TV studio, I guess, or you could have set it in a film. But by choosing to set it in advertising, you both had a very interesting milieu, and it was a fantastic vehicle through which to see both inherent contradictions in American culture and also extraordinary changes, because I suppose it goes from the 1950s to the Coke ad would be early 70s. So it covers an extraordinary kind of 1.75 decades or something of that kind. And an ad agency is, in two respects, I think it's a perfect way to see it, because, of course, it was also a kind of golden age of consumerism. It was an economic golden age in many respects for the people in the US, but also the ad agency is a very, very unusual culture.
Yeah, 'cause they kind of mirror change, and they also drive the change as well. And I was going to say one.
Yes, that I think is true. I mean, probably to an extent that's true of the film industry, or broadcasting in general, or journalism. But no, you're right in that you have to be absolutely. One nice thing about working in advertising, and I have friends who work in the film industry and things like that, is you can't afford to get completely out of touch. So, I mean, a friend of mine who worked in the film industry said, if you have a Hollywood megastar and they walk out of their hotel and there isn't a car waiting for them, they're confused. Okay, that literally kind of, it's not a question they're angry; they just don't understand what's
It's
going
what
on.
they expect.
I would argue, if you work in advertising, it doesn't matter how rich you become, how successful you become, you have to do your own shopping. You have to empty the dishwasher. You can't. It would be an absolutely hideous mistake to become completely detached from the lived experience of the people you're talking to. I hope that's true. I think that's true of journalism as well. I think that's certainly true of tabloid journalism. You can't afford ivory towers because you can, in some weird way, no longer do your job.
There's a funny thing where there was a Japanese minister recently, and I think he's like the computer minister or some sort of digital minister, and he confessed that he'd never used a computer, or he always gets somebody else to do like his work for him, and it was kind of like a big uproar in Japan related to that. And also in the
That,
1960s,
that by the way, that was true of Tony Blair. Interestingly, which always struck me as the strangest thing about Tony Blair, in that in his office he had a computer. But I think for the entire duration of his premiership, which lasted from 97 to whatever it was, he never turned it on. And I'm sure he uses a mobile phone, or I'm sure he migrated to a BlackBerry later. Okay. But given that that was the kind of high point of internet innovation, it always betokened to be an extraordinary lack of curiosity. But it seemed to be a government that operated, almost entirely through kind of conversation. Maybe he was right not to turn it on. I mean, this is another interesting question, that there are elements of technology which I think we'll need to rid ourselves of at some point, simply because if you look at the percentage of people's time, particularly younger people, which is devoted to screen time,
before I was going
so,
to, sorry.
it's a lot. It's not healthy at some point. I mean, we, as advertising people, we've got to be alert to this because we're funding it. We are funding clickbait. We are funding, content which is beguiling, addictive, appealing, irresistible, attention-seeking, but which, like any other kind of addiction, or anything else that's a kind of habit-forming behavior. We do need to ask ourselves moral questions about this. I mean, David Ogilvy famously thought effectively that billboards were immoral as a form of advertising, because he said it broke the contract with the public, in that on television and in the press, you were funding something. Even in direct mail, you were funding a public good. Okay, it was the surrounding content, the existence of a newspaper, the existence of a TV channel. Whereas in the billboard, you were simply giving money to a landowner to impose a message upon random passers-by with no benefit to them.
Yeah, I was going to say, with one thing I was going to say was there was a contradiction in the 1960s where they had Star Trek, and it was completely fine for Captain Kirk to like kiss aliens, and he kisses a black woman, it causes uproar in America. And also, would you think that now, because you've got YouTube and Spotify, sometimes you'll be inundated with ads? And for example, with Spotify, I listen to it, and it'll say you will listen to this advert, you got free 30 minutes of listening to the music, and then immediately, like 2 songs later, it'll give you another advert, and then you'll have the YouTube adverts, which will be like 1 minute long. And
Yeah.
I don't think it's going to really drive people to buy those products if that's the way you are presented, like in that sort of
The
your negative
metric
connotations with those adverts.
the metrics in modern day advertising are actually appalling, because what digital media makes possible is it makes it very, very easy, indeed almost automatic, to measure certain things. When it's very easy to measure something, unsurprisingly, we measure it. But then what nearly always happens is that a metric migrates into a target. And there's a wonderful phrase, I think it's called Metcalfe's law, which is that that once a metric becomes a target, it loses its value as a metric, by dint of the fact that people are pursuing it. And I think that's happened to education to some extent. I think education started. I'll give you an example of that. The 11 plus, which still exists here in Kent. If you talk to people who took the 11 plus, which decided whether you went to grammar school or whether you went to a secondary modern school back in the 1970s, okay, the people who took that exam, not all of them, I'm sure, but most of them, came into school one day and they said, today we're going to do an exam. Well, they took the exam, and some of them did well and some of them did badly, and it decided which school you went to. When suddenly then richer parents started basically prepping their children for the 11 plus, and buying in tutors, okay? And more extreme than that, the private schools would teach to the test, and the state schools in Kent do not teach for the 11 plus, okay? The value that has as a metric is significantly damaged. It was intended, it was intended as an impartial IQ test. Now we'd have a completely separate debate about IQ, and we can have a completely separate debate about whether it's sensible to separate children out at the age of 11 and then make that division irreversible, which seems to be the case. We can have a completely separate debate about that, which was obviously ridiculous to some extent. But nonetheless, once these things, become effectively enshrined as targets, then they're no longer a metric. But they were no longer good. They weren't even good metrics. Never mind the fact that they're not good targets. I mean, there's no real correlation between the profitability of a business and the click-through rate it manages to attain, for example. It's not really a very healthy thing. It also causes people to focus on very short-term behavioral effects of advertising,
Yeah, because
um, at the
and
expense of longer-term brand building and fame. I mean, fame is slow. There are people who are overnight sensations, okay, but they tend also to disappear quite quickly. Building enduring fame is a very, very slow process.
yeah, 'cause one of the things they had with targets is I was watching the Netflix documentary on Grenfell, and the Grenfell building with the council, they chose the cheapest cladding and it saved them £5,000. So that £5,000 saving, and you've got the 70 people dead, millions going towards Grenfell and all the things related to it now. Where's that saving? Like that saving's gone or disappeared, and the
It, it,
treasury is
it,
kind of like that as well.
it's interesting in a sense that because no one individual is to blame. I mean, the intention to clad the building was partly driven by, I think, environmental factors and partly driven by aesthetics. But the people at the time thought they were doing a good thing. What then happens in modern decision making is that you have individual departments will optimize for one thing. And so, for example, it used to be the case in construction projects that the architect had final sign off on the materials used. And in public sector procurement, it now is the case that the architect merely stipulates, and then the procurement person will find what meets that definition at the lowest possible price. Now, in some ways, that's their job. Okay, I appreciate that. But what will tend to happen is that the normal sort of feedback loops of this stuff is much cheaper, are we sure it's okay? Once some particular, specification is determined, okay, that needs to be a kind of iterative process, I would argue. The act of specifying things, that not much in business is completely linear, and not much in a real business can be separated into individual silos of decision making. But that's how we've chosen to do things. Now, I think there are exceptions to that. I think family businesses are different because and I think that small businesses are different. Now, if you grew up in a shop or you grew up in a restaurant, for example, I always say everybody who grows up in a shop or grows up in a very small business, it's a free MBA because you get to understand all the elements of business and how they interconnect. So there's obviously purchasing, there's obviously logistics. If you're running a shop, there's marketing.
I'd
Okay,
say it's probably better than
there's
actual MBA because you're seeing a real world
yes,
example
it
where there's
is. You're
cash flow.
seeing. You're absolutely right. Absolutely right. And you understand all the problems. There's marketing. There's customer service. There's customer relations. There's segmentation. You start to look at what's really making us money here and what isn't. That's why all corner shops always sold birthday cards because they were hugely profitable. They all sold newspapers not because they were profitable, but because they generated footfall. And you understood all these kind of feedback loops that were going on within the business.
Yeah, because you
And
have.
then,
I was
and
going
I
to say
think
from.
that's a fundamentally better understanding of a business than saying we've got a procurement department, we've got a purchasing department. Once you start doing that, who is left other than perhaps the CEO to understand the actual the business as a whole as its customers perceive it?
Yeah, because you see that with Costco. So they'll have the $2 hot dog, and if you had some sort of like McKinsey or some sort of big firm or the Wall Street, they'd be like, no, you need to get rid of this. You need to put the prices up. And if you're the Costco CEO, you'll be like adamant. This is a hill I'm willing to die on. We're not doing this. I like the 1.99 hot dogs. you're not going to get rid of this.
I think that's right, isn't it? And actually, I met the daughter of Herb Kelleher, and obviously Southwest Airlines is no longer under family control, but the business of making checked-in luggage, getting rid of free checked-in luggage, I think that was a mistake. I think there are other things they could have done, put it that way. I mean, by the way, the direction of travel in these things is not always a mistake, but the very crude way in which they're done without much consideration of consumer reaction, I think that's a mistake. Um, you know, and so you're absolutely right. It's a bit like IKEA saying the meatballs aren't very profitable. The meatballs aren't there to be profitable. Okay. And so understanding, I think, those little things. Famously, the marketing director of DoubleTree always wants to get rid of is always has to fight for the preservation of the free bag of cookies you get on check-in. You know,
Yep.
and that's partly because there are a lot of metrics for financials, and there aren't any metrics for psychologicals. Or they're more difficult to attain, or they're slower, or they're more ambiguous, or whatever it may be. And so this quantification bias is the name for it, where we don't actually focus on what's important, we focus on what we can measure. Even the very popular phrase, what gets measured gets managed, which is usually used approvingly or as a kind of exhortation, was originally written as a criticism. And I think the advertising industry has suffered immensely from this, because you're not even, there's a danger, by the way, in a data driven world where there's no room for anecdotes. Now, anecdotes, weirdly, although it's usually used disparagingly to say something's anecdotal, anecdotes are usually where really telling information emerges first. And so we're in danger of creating a very efficient information transmission system in business, which is, however, efficient, fast, and abundant, but not very rich.
Yeah. Now you've mentioned psychological, I'll say my third question. Well, not third question, but I have an idea. I've been thinking of is how you mentioned psychological solutions. So in your book
Mm-hmm.
Magic, so you got simpler, cheaper, and faster solutions and policies to problems that bring about utility and extra comfort to a larger number of people. So you gave the example of the dot matrix schemes, which gave ETAs to travellers on the tube, or like potentially bringing Wi-Fi to trains. So we've got a new Labour government. It's been over a year now, but they've lost popularity very quickly. They're also facing the threat of reform, and they don't have very much money to spend. What do you think are some psychological solutions that they could do, that Keir Starmer could do, or even potentially the next Prime Minister, whether it's Farage or somebody else, could they do that's good for a large number of people
I've
and quite
often
cheap?
wondered about this, by the way. And one of the things I think you could do to get re-elected is to take on things. What has happened through political polarization is that politics has been reduced to a form of point scoring, which is you want to prove that a left-wing policy works, or you want to prove that a right-wing policy works. And that's limited the solution space, and it's also limited the definitions, I think, of where government gets involved. And so there are things like potholes, okay, which there's no, I don't think, okay, you could make a point, you could make a left-wing point, which is that potholes are there to because we must get rid of potholes because they're very dangerous to cyclists, which is a totally fair point, okay. Or you could equally make the point that we need to get rid of potholes because they're annoying to motorists, which is equally true, and they lead to all kinds of manners of wastage, like tires needing to be replaced, and driving becomes less safe. There are lots and lots of reasons. By the way, we have cyclists to thank, by the way, for the macadamization of roads, for the most part. The early campaigns for better road surfaces were driven actually by the 19th century cycling lobby, long before there was really a car lobby. But that I refuse to believe, okay, that there isn't a more efficient. Now, it might be something of a botch, but I refuse to believe that in 70 years of improvements in chemistry, there isn't a more efficient way to fill in potholes, at least temporarily. okay, than by putting loads of cones down and farting around for 48 hours. I just don't believe that's true. Okay. I think there's an innovation out there which for some reason is not being adopted, and you could do that. So one of the problems with economics is that economics tends to focus on a model which involves the trade-off. And my friend who's an economist, Nicholas Gruen, talks about this. And so as a result, people with an economic mindset look for a trade-off in order then to find an optimal point between those two extremes. Now, the problem with that is sometimes in life, there aren't trade-offs, there's magic. Okay? So I mentioned Southwest Airlines earlier. Southwest Airlines, all airlines believed there was a kind of trade-off between punctuality, customer service, and price. And Southwest Airlines basically argued that no, if you have very fast turnarounds of the plane, which is why they didn't have allocated seating to begin with, by the way, you could achieve punctuality and save money at the same time. Okay? That it was always assumed that punctuality had to emerge from buffers in the system. And they said, no, 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 if you have a very, very efficient system, you don't need the buffers. You don't need the plane, allowing, So effectively, Southwest Airlines was a case where it was a resolution, effectively, of a creative resolution of two previously seen to be contradictory elements. Okay? And I would argue there's quite a lot of magic out there. So, by the way, I think one problem with the UK economically is I think our mobile coverage is very, very bad. Okay. And okay, there was a time 20 years ago when we were laying down the mobile network or whatever, where, there was controversy about where you put a mast and so forth. But for all kinds of complicated reasons, not all of them the fault of the mobile operators, the quality of mobile coverage you get in the UK is worse than you get in, say, Portugal. All right. Now, some of it is because we're early, da 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 da. There are all kinds of things going on. But, I think one of the things government should do is stop worrying about winning political arguments and start solving human problems. And strangely, those briefs within government, like transportation, okay, are generally held by someone as a minister for about 9 months at a time, and they're viewed as a stepping stone to something else.
Exactly.
I think if you made the Minister of Transport, you said, if someone said, "I will be Minister of Transport, I will do this I will only do this if I can do it for 4 years, and I'm going to set myself some really, passenger focused KPIs on how we can improve things. And then if we get human behavior changing, we'll get the economic gains as a byproduct of that." I think you could do something really significant. And funnily enough, Steve Norris, who was the Minister for Transport, he's now basically said, having been Minister for Transport, he said, "I suddenly realised while doing that job for probably too short a time, this is actually everything. It matters a huge amount in economics. It matters a huge amount in terms of the quality of people's lives, what they can do, whether we have economic growth." Okay, he said, transport and connectivity, you might say, is more or less everything in an economy, and yet it's treated as this sideline thing. Now, I suggested, I still believe, the government should give everybody in the UK premium Zoom access. I think the government, the Department of Education, should give everybody in the UK with children YouTube Premium. Okay, because we give everybody we tax everybody and we give them the BBC. Okay, you're not allowed to opt out of the BBC. Now, it's a pity it's American, not British, but there you go. If you went to YouTube, I don't know what the percentage of people with YouTube Premium is in the UK, but it's probably about 5%. You went to YouTube and you said, okay, we're going to give this to every family in the UK. In return, we're going to give you a lot of money. We're going to influence slightly. We're not going to censor anything, but we might slightly influence the algorithm to make it more educational. Okay. Now, okay, here, just an anecdotal thing, okay? Now, I did A-level maths, but I last did anything significantly mathematical other than that basic addition, multiplication, and a bit of statistics needed for my work. I last did something mathematical in 1984. That was when I did my A levels. Okay. I now find myself sitting on YouTube Premium watching people solve equations. And I can't remember his name, an Indian guy. Okay.
Was it
And
Khan Academy? Is
it's
it?
not Khan Academy. There's a guy who basically just does puzzles and and it's the equivalent of mental gymnastics.
Yeah.
But he'll put maths Olympiad questions up there, and it's basically a film of him talking with a pen, solving the equation. Now, if you told me 7 years ago, if you gone to the BBC and said, we want to make a program where people solve equations on a fucking screen, okay, right?
They'll never sign up.
I've suddenly, at the age of 59, weirdly, I've come to understand things that I never fully grasped when I was doing A-level mathematics. Now, this is astonishing. And I'm watching that for fun because they're just the right length. Okay, it's not a 45-minute maths lesson of, oh, fuck, here we go. It's literally, okay, I'll sit down for 6 or 7 minutes and there's a, strange, maths Olympiad question. And I'm watching it. On the edge of my seat is perhaps an overstatement. But this is actually, and I don't know if everybody's like that, okay? But I mean, doesn't matter. 5% of the population will end up watching equations for fun. Bingo. That should be part of the education budget.
Well, I'll say a funny little point.
Zoom access should be part of the transportation budget, because the best way you can improve our rail and road network is by getting unnecessary journeys off the roads and the rails.
Exactly.
And one of the best things Zoom has done, I'll give you an example of this. There was an awful dilemma, I hate to say it, okay, if a friend of yours died overseas. Which is, do we basically spend a huge amount of money buying a ticket at short notice, which cost a fortune, okay, and flying out to the family funeral, okay, or do we not go? Now, I've attended an overseas bar mitzvah. I've attended a funeral in the Netherlands, okay, virtually, which for many of these occasions is the perfect middle ground that never previously existed. It was previously, oh my God, what do we do? It was my cousin, whatever it might be. I feel I have to go to the funeral. I can't just not go. Okay. With weddings, there was always a telegram that got read out. Okay. That was the kind of default compromise. But these technologies are really, really important. And what government has done is it hasn't actually really said to what extent do these technologies, if with intelligent planning, to what extent can we use them to solve problems? In terms of solving problems psychologically, okay. I mean, if you look at the negative impressions of the NHS, I don't know how many of them emerged from an experience at A&E, okay. But one of my mischievous jokes about the NHS is the worst thing about the NHS is its architects. I don't know why they do this, okay, but when they build a hospital that's practically half the size of the Pentagon. And then A&E is like this little shed about the size of my flat. Now, either you want to get rid of that altogether, and maybe there's a solution to that. Maybe you do something different. I mean, there are loads and loads of what you might call nudge style interventions that can solve problems by changing perception and thereby changing behavior, rather than using economic incentives or legislation, which are the two default problem-solving modes which government currently uses. I'll give you an example. If it was known that pharmacists had priority access to GP's appointments, right? So, there are a certain number of GP appointments every day which are reserved to people they can be booked by pharmacists, but they can't be booked by the individual patient. But what would happen is people who had a urinary tract infection, say, would go into the pharmacist, and the pharmacist would say, I need a doctor's appointment because I've got this UTI. The pharmacist would say, I'm now authorized to prescribe antibiotics. You have a UTI. You don't need to see the GP because I can prescribe you what you need. Okay. Or even better, I will prescribe you what you need. I will reserve you a GP's appointment in 4 days' time in the event that it hasn't got any better. Okay. And if it's got better, you will be sent a text, okay, every day.
Hello, sorry about that. It just ended on me. Can you hear me?
Yeah, no, no, I'll get my video back in a second. Here we go. Don't worry. This is why, you see, we should give YouTube Premium to everybody in the UK because we got cut off.
That was Zoom. That was my fault.
No, no, don't worry. No, no, no. But if you want to boil this all down, okay, the problem with government is it relies on legal and economic frameworks for most uh, problems. And a colleague of mine, a wonderful guy called Graham Fink, said the UK needs a creative director. And the UK also needs, the UK government needs a creative department and it needs a marketing function, which is not a question of what is, it's a question of what if. And I would argue that the number of, now, you know, whatever you think of the Thatcher government, it did some fairly rad things like privatization, for example.
Yeah.
Now, I think in some sectors, I think that worked well. I think in some sectors, it worked quite well, actually, like the railways, because most people go, ooh, terrible privatized railways. Okay, don't realize that one, the private companies don't make very much money. It's not like the water companies where they kind of distorted things. Um, and actually, I think on balance, I would say the privatization of the railways improved the railways. Now, we don't know how they would have improved if we continued. We don't have a parallel thing, but nonetheless, railways got better, and that's evidenced by the number of people taking them. Okay. Um, and I think that there is that fundamentally, let me explain this, okay? I've only recently come up with this analogy. There are two parts to the world. My contention is that Aldi has discovered the meaning of life, okay? Now, let me explain, okay? There's the bit of Aldi which is, I need to buy food for my family, I want to buy it as quickly as possible. That's thin-tailed, it's an efficiency optimization game. Then there's the middle aisle in Aldi, which is completely the opposite. It's, I don't know if I want anything here, but let's see if we can get lucky. Okay. And mathematically, that's actually the explore exploit trade off manifested in a retail environment. I mean, the two extremes I would give are sometimes you should go to Asda and sometimes you should go to TK Maxx. Okay. And government, if you are extremely rational, you will never go to TK Maxx.
So it's like the
Okay.
analogy where everything's done by the
And
treasury.
so everything's done by the Treasury, who are basically Asda shoppers. And you don't have TK Maxx shoppers. Now, what's interesting about TK, do you go to TK Maxx? I'm always intrigued because it polarizes people, right? Do you go?
Yeah, I go every now and then because they have
Yeah,
some. I don't
you've got to
buy
go.
too many high-end fashion stuff, but sometimes they have like premium labels for like a better price, or they have a lot of good
Yeah, yeah.
household stuff as well.
And actually, the point about TK Maxx is I've got a Northern Irish Protestant friend who goes, I can't start over. I never. Because she went there with something to buy in mind. And I said, you don't go there with something to buy in mind. You go there trying to get lucky. Okay. And I would argue there actually is a fundamental philosophical point here, which is that what government has done by being controlled by the Treasury is one of the reasons why I think you have popularist movements is that government never does anything incredible.
Yeah, it's always
Okay. It's always like a grinding narrative of scarcity and efficiency. And I think this is actually weirdly a product of the IT of the permeation of both economics and I think also of IT and measurement. And you know, fundamentally, I think you should live your life. You know, I think Aldi is actually a philosophy of life. Spend some of your time doing the things that you have to do as well as you possibly can, but you have to leave 20% space for getting lucky.
yeah. Because another thing I was going to say was you talked about I'm a teacher. And you said free YouTube Premium, so I'll give you like a funny little anecdote. So one of my co-workers, she's a teacher as well, and she's putting a YouTube video on, and they are really good and informative and educated students. Quite good at the start of a lesson as well. But one of the adverts was for basically adult toys. Like before, it's full of like 30. There's 30 like it was in a boys' school as well, so it was 30 male students or seeing this advert before the video pops up, and it's unskippable as well. So she realized that in the future she needs to like mute the video and
But
then
also the problem
extend
is
it.
they will think that ad was targeted at her based on her past viewing history, won't they?
It is, but the thing is, it pops up like with random adverts can sometimes pop up even if you not directly look for something as well. So that's quite funny.
So
And
do schools have a YouTube premium subscription? Can they
uh,
buy one?
some schools do. It depends on the what the school goes down, because that school at that time I was at, they had Google, so they only use like Google Docs and all that kind of suite of software, and like Google Classroom, and that's quite good. But it didn't come with YouTube Premium with it, which I think probably should have. And some other schools just go with the Microsoft suite of stuff, like so they get access to Teams and other stuff like that. And in that school, we also had Jacob Rees-Mogg come down once, and I asked him about psychological solutions. And he said one thing was, I think in his local area, there was a traffic light sequence that was really, really bad, and it was taking up loads of time, and it made people really unhappy. And they switched in, I think, put sensors in the traffic lights, and then it made things so much faster, and it
Well,
helped so many people.
I would even argue turn it into a mini roundabout, and then it becomes self-regulating and more efficient. But you're right. You're absolutely right. Yeah, yeah. I mean, you have literally. I mean, I think Sadiq Khan is in some ways naughty here, because I think there's a sort of subtle strategy in transport for. I think in the mayor's office, which is let's make driving in London really shit. Okay, so people don't want to do it. Now, that is, of course, a regulating mechanism, just as you can regulate attendance at things by creating a huge queue. Okay, but I don't think it's a good thing to do. Because it's fundamentally economically wasteful. That you could have a rationing mechanism. One of the things I strongly believe, by the way, is I think everybody should be able to drive into the congestion zone once or twice a year for free. Okay. One, it's not worth people who only drive into London once a year registering for the fucking congestion zone anyway. Okay. Right. But also, I think, it's the right of any freeborn Briton to drive into their capital city and drive up the mole once a year. Okay. I think there are loads and loads of really intelligent things we could be doing, um, which could genuinely make things better. I mean, I find the debate about flexible work, a very interesting question, of course, in teaching is to what extent do you flip the classroom? So, to what extent do you actually, in other words, historically, the show and tell was in the classroom, and the go and do these exercises was done at home. And I know it's about 30 years old, I'm out of date, but there was a whole debate about do we use technology to flip that? So we tell people to go home and watch YouTube videos, and you build in a few checks and balances to make sure they've actually watched them.
Yep.
Okay. And then in the classroom, when they have help readily at hand, you give them exercises to do. Now, we don't know, but I mean that flipping the classroom thing, maybe. So Jacob Rees-Mogg made that point that simply by installing
Yeah, but
sensible
he was trying to say
sensors.
that essentially what sometimes happens is that sometimes government ministers will try to do a big project, which could be quite expensive, takes a long time, and then they can like lord it over people and say, "That's my achievement. I got this really big project done." And an example I have of that is, do you know those two aircraft carriers that Britain made? So that they had the Queen Elizabeth
Yes.
aircraft carriers. So they're ginormous. They probably can't ever be used in a war. And you saw Keir Starmer mention that we'll be involved in the Taiwan war and blah blah blah. If Taiwan gets involved, Britain will also participate. But if you look at the Chinese missiles and how many they're producing and the caliber of missiles they're producing, they could easily destroy those ships, and Britain would have like no capability of really getting involved in that war. But because of like the British history of having a massive navy, and you had like Tony Blair and then you had David Cameron, and they all kind of approved of this massive these two expensive aircraft carriers, so it's something that was done with
I
trying to
mean, it was
show off,
interesting.
but it's not really practical and it's very expensive.
I mean, it was an interesting debate during the Falklands War whether should you have just sent down like 100 container ships, basically just to get in the way of shit. Okay, so no, undoubtedly, what you're right is that there's this slight problem, which is another governmental thing, and I blame engineers for this, which is you either do nothing or you do something perfect,
And there's no in between for them.
and there's no in between. So the example I got very cross about was you want people to get heat pumps, if you can. It's a very efficient, it's a 5-to-1 energy efficiency gain. And the UK has a climate which is particularly well suited to heat pumps because generally the difference between the outdoor climate and the indoor climate, it's not like Canada or somewhere. Okay. And the idea is that in order to get a grant for a heat pump, you have to rip out your boiler, rip out your radiators, okay, dig up your lawn, get a load of weird people round, creating total disruption, okay. Well, to be absolutely honest, it's not worth it. I can't be bothered. Okay. Now, on the other hand, if you get an air conditioning unit, you can buy them one room at a time, so it's scalable. Okay. And during the all but the coldest weather, your air conditioning unit can work backwards as effectively an air-to-air heat pump. Now, I could do that. Okay. I can imagine myself doing that. First of all, now the argument is this isn't perfect. No, it isn't perfect, but it's perfect behaviorally because it's actually doable. Whereas their weird vision for what a heat pump is, okay, is not doable. Okay.
Yeah,
Now the other thing is they haven't put marketing brains in this, because if you actually said, okay, air conditioning units, if they are too bidirectional, right? Now, okay, I appreciate the fact that in very hot weather this will increase the demands on the grid, but generally there's a lot of solar energy in hot weather and blah 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 blah. Okay, you could even have air conditioning units that actually only worked when the grid. You could even have it. It works as an air conditioner when there's an abundance of clean energy. The rest of the time, it's a heat pump. Okay. Now they've done a sort of grant system. If instead you said it's free installation, you buy the unit and the government pays for the installation, right? Now, in economic terms, that may be less generous than a grant. But in marketing terms, it's far more powerful. I get a thing, the government, it's a bit like free delivery, Amazon Prime, right?
yep.
I pay for the thing, you pay for the delivery. We go, yeah, I get that. Monkey brain happy, right? If Amazon Prime worked by some system where you paid for delivery and then they gave you some money back, it wouldn't be as potent.
Yeah, because I feel government policy sometimes creates like massive cliff edges where if you go above something, you'll be like very penalised. So you've got like the 100k, is it 100k or 150k, where if you go over that, you'll make a massive, you'll lose so many things and you'll hardly get anything. And there's also with some of the stuff with welfare, like if you try to take on any more hours or do something differently, then you'll be massively penalised. So rather than getting things into a better direction, people rather be in the position they are now, because if they go and make that risk, the downside's just too negative, and that does happen in government policy quite a lot.
So you could perfectly well have an air conditioning unit. If you were over, you would have an air conditioning unit which would basically had some rules. If you're elderly, you could use it any time you wanted. If you weren't elderly, it would only actually work as an air conditioning unit when there was a fairly decent abundance of cheap electricity, of clean electricity. Okay, the interesting thing is that technology is in some ways magical, but the people who deploy the technology, if it's the treasury, they will basically look at the technology through a money-saving lens. And I think one of the tragedies of what's happened, I think, over the last 10 years is that if you look at businesses, effectively they go, we need technology so we can get rid of people, not we need technology so we can make people's lives amazing. In other words, they focus the technology on the cost line of the balance sheet, not on the revenue line. How could we produce a really amazing service that would make our customers love us more than they do now, while retaining current, or more or less maintaining current levels of customer service? Instead, they've done basically, how can we replace people
And save money.
And it's unimaginative, and it's also inappropriate, because the roles that are performed by the people generally don't map neatly on to what technology does.
Yeah, because they did that with the self checkouts. They pushed everyone to go with the self checkouts, and then obviously, I think there was Walmart or somewhere where they got rid of all their self checkouts because they realized people were stealing.
Booths did up north, and it was, first of all, you don't feel as bad stealing from a machine as you do, for all kinds of reasons, because I suspect partly because it meant people were checking out avocados and pretending they were carrots. Okay. And they should have predicted that. I mean, that was shameful. But what was the problem is it started as an option and became an obligation. And the only time I've actually stolen something from a supermarket since I was 4 years old, okay, was once when literally the machine was so bad I tried to scan something, and it had literally, by the time I'd actually spent 5 minutes of my time failing to scan an item, I said, "This is now your problem, it's not mine," and I just put them in the bag. I've only done that once, and I had literally put 5 minutes of my time trying to make something work. I tried to get human assistance, and at that point, when I couldn't get a human to help me and it wouldn't scan, and I'd already invested 5 minutes in purchasing something that cost £2.25, I went, right, okay, you deserve to be punished for this incompetence. Okay, I feel no compunction now. Bear in mind, I've only done that once. I don't. Right. Okay, but the circumstances in my case were so extreme that I just went. There was nobody available to help. I just went, okay, you're taking the piss now.
Yeah, because there's another case where, like, if you go to the self checkouts and there's a massive, massive queue, and you've got a lot of items, you might think, and all the self checkouts have like somebody needs to buy alcohol or something like that, and then the person has to keep coming and it slows the whole thing down. Some people might just drop their basket or trolley and just leave the
But
store.
but the bigger problem was you can't really self check out a big weekly shop. So the danger you've got if you're Tesco, if you're a massive Tesco, okay, right? If you're one of those shops which people drive 7 miles to spend 130 quid to feed their family for 8 days or whatever, okay. So what you're doing is you're not optimizing for this is a critical thing. There's an assumption among finance people that cost reduction is in and of itself has no effect on revenue. That's not a safe assumption, because now if you're a huge Asda and people can't self checkout, so they start shopping 43 times. I've got to go in a couple of minutes, by the way.
Yeah, that's fine.
What?
Why did you change the Mad Masters meeting?
I didn't change anything. I haven't changed any meeting. Okay, we better ask them. Okay. Then people will start shopping little and often. Okay, when they shop little and often, they ain't going to a huge Tesco anymore, right? Now obviously those effects will play out over months or even years. I mean, a lot of the predictions about the increase in demand for rail travel, okay, the assumption was that these are underlying trends where more and more people are going by train. A lot of it, I think, was two things. It was two one-off events, which is booking rail travel by train. Okay, first of all, made it much easier to check train times and prices from home. Okay, without going to a station. Secondly, it also brought in dynamic pricing, which made rail travel a lot more attractive to whole classes of people. My daughter was a student in Manchester. Okay, if you'd stuck with the usual kind of set priced rail tickets, I don't, I mean, I don't think students would ever go into London for the lols or whatever, whatever they used to do.
Yeah.
Okay. But if you knew you could maybe get a ticket for 20 quid, then you did it. Okay. Now, so I think those were two big technological interface changes which had a really, really big effect on behavior. But of course, they weren't. That's not a safe thing from which you can then extrapolate forwards and say, so in 2035, lots more people are going to be traveling by train because Zoom comes along or electric cars come along, which make it insanely cheap to drive places, for good and for ill. Okay. And so a lot of these extrapolations are based on assumptions about how markets work, which simply aren't accurate. And by the way, Mark, the other thing is you don't see the connection between online train booking and online train timetables and usage because it takes 5 to 10 years for that to filter through the population, you see. What you see is a long increasing trend.
Yeah.
Gosh, aren't more and more people going by train? Whereas all it is one person at a time. People are learning they can check train times on the internet, check prices online without the commitment of going to a railway station, and then they discover that occasionally there are bargains to be had. So, I mean, once you start looking at data without factoring in human perception and behavior and the fact that also human behavior is also herd based, so that if your mate's going to London on the train from Manchester, you might go along, right?
Yeah.
So there are all these non-linear factors going on in a marketplace, and we've got a load of economists trying to model marketplaces as if they're mechanistic devices.
Well, you know how good economists are, like predicting things. They always predict like 10 of the last 4 economic recessions because they always like over predicting there'll be a crash here or a crash there, and the predictions are always way off.
No, I'm sorry I've got a dash now, but I'm very happy to do a later interview if that's useful. But no, I mean, I think the people, we will see a massive misalignment of the value of AI because it will be used principally from people who want to reduce costs rather than people who want to improve service. Because it's always easy to get a budget to reduce a cost, and it's always difficult to get a budget to effectively try and do something amazing.
Yeah, that does happen. When they can't measure something, then it's always difficult to make that argument to certain people.
And in a sentence, it's what it is that costs are visible, and you cut costs, you get an immediate benefit. Opportunity costs are nebulous and usually a bit delayed. And so the cost-cutting side of AI will predominate, and the make my life amazing part of AI, and that applies. Government is merely an extension of the private sector and the extent to which the Treasury actually has rights of veto over everything.
Yes, you've been very generous with your time. I've really enjoyed this.
No problem at all.
Hopefully, we can do this at some point in the future as well. So I'll probably like email, and I was really glad we could have this conversation. Yeah, but very nice. Thank you for having me, and have a good day.
It's been a pleasure.
Excellent.
Anytime.
Thank you.
All the best. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.